Gulf War Syndrome. Today, around 250,000 veterans are still disabled by a mysterious disease known as Gulf War Syndrome, a medical anomaly with a distinctive set of symptoms that strangely only affect soldiers who served in the 1991 Persian Gulf War. For decades, the causes of this peculiar chronic illness baffled and divided scientists as they debated whether the malady had a psychological or biological explanation. And it's only recently, over 30 years after the end of the conflict, that some of them have claimed to have found the definitive answer. The Gulf War. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein ordered Iraqi troops to cross the border into neighboring Kuwait just 2 hours after the breakdown of peace negotiations, claiming that the Kuwaitis were illegally extracting oil from the Al Rumalia oil fields that straddled both sides of the frontier. By August 8th, Hussein had formally annexed Kuwait and was referring to it as Iraqi's 19th province. In response, a 956,000-strong NATO peacekeeping mission dubbed Operation Desert Storm, composed of soldiers from the USA, the UK, France, the UAE, Egypt, and many other nations, was sent to the Middle East to liberate Kuwait from an Iraqi army that numbered around 650,000 personnel. On the morning of January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm commenced with a devastating U.S. airstrike targeting Iraqi air defenses, communication relays, weapon factories, and oil refineries. Following a 5-week campaign of aerial bombardment, NATO ground troops would finally make an appearance on February 24th for Operation Desert Saber, where they were ordered to make incursions into Kuwait and southern Iraq. It would prove a decisive intervention, for within the space of just 4 days, the Iraqis were expelled from Kuwait, while NATO forces penetrated the region of Iraq just south of the contested Al Rumalia oil field, overcoming the last pocket of Iraqi resistance there a day before a ceasefire was announced on February 28th, where Saddam Hussein agreed to the respective sovereignty of Kuwait and to dispose all of his weapons of mass destruction. Gulf War Syndrome and Symptoms. Although the war had officially ended, for many Gulf War participants on both sides, it would mark the start of another, more personal battle. With the ink barely dried on the armistice documents, many veterans began to contract a diverse catalog of perplexing symptoms, ranging from cognitive issues like depression, forgetfulness, loss of focus, and insomnia, to physiological problems such as headaches, fatigue, back pain, as well as respiratory and gastrointestinal disorders. 6 months after the war came the release of the first documented cases of Gulf War Syndrome from the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Denmark. But it was only after the 1998 landmark passing of the Persian Gulf War Veterans Act by the US government that a serious evaluation of Gulf War Syndrome was undertaken, with researchers initially believing this multi-symptom sickness to be either the result of psychological trauma or a consequence of chemical overexposure. Explanations: psychological or biological. Psychological stressors. Among the first explanations offered for Gulf War Syndrome was that similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, suggesting it was a psychological disorder arising from the stresses of combat, with advocates pointing to the well-established fact that traumatic experience could cause a multitude of psychological and biological side effects. It's true that although the Gulf War was brief, it was just as violent as many other conflicts. A survey of thousands of combatants revealed that they were most distressed when witnessing the death or injury of an enemy soldier, being attacked by enemy fire, or seeing a comrade wounded or killed in front of their eyes. While many captured U.S. Marines have related how they were brutally tortured by Iraqis and were routinely electrocuted, beaten, and struck with canes, pieces of wood, and improvised whips. The psychological argument, however, has largely been dismantled by an avalanche of research, which indicates that even the most extreme combat-related psychological stressors were not significantly associated with Gulf War Syndrome. To add to this, rates of PTSD were found to be much lower in Gulf War veterans, while the vast majority of Gulf War Syndrome sufferers were not found to have a psychiatric illness. However, interestingly enough, combat stress was found to exacerbate the side effects of chemical exposure, a phenomenon that more convincingly explains the causes of Gulf War Syndrome. Chemical exposure. Throughout the short duration of the Gulf War, combatants were consistently exposed to harmful chemical substances that could come in a variety of forms. Perhaps the most easily recognizable for their smoke plumes could be seen for hundreds of kilometers were the poisonous gases that emanated from over 750 oil well fires, such as dioxin, which if inhaled in great amounts could cause skin rashes, fatigue, headaches, and insomnia. Next were pesticides employed to kill the swarms of dangerous insects that resided in the Persian Gulf and to prevent the spread of sandfly fever, a disease that affected around 60% of British and U.S. troops. Issued with sprays, creams, and liquids for use on the skin, uniforms, and bedding, as well as crates full of pest strips, 15 of these products actually contained toxins that were detrimental to human health, with the U.S. Army estimating that as many as 40,000 soldiers may have been overexposed to pesticides such as pyrethroids, which were applied to uniforms up to 30 times a month, organochlorines, a neurotoxin used to kill lice, and diethyltoluamide, more commonly known as DEET, the most frequently used insect repellent for the skin that was also known to damage plastic materials. Furthermore, in order to safeguard troops from possible chemical attacks, soldiers were obliged to carry with them packets with 21-pyridostigmine bromide pills in order to reduce the effects of exposure to nerve agents. Although the recommended dose was 30 milligrams every 8 hours for a time period of 72 hours, followed by a 24-hour break, troops often ignored it and took it constantly after widespread reports of dead sheep, goats, and camels convinced many that the Iraqi invaders were actively using chemical weapons. Numbering over 5.3 million doses, a reported 250,000 NATO personnel took PB tablets, which, if injected too frequently, can cause side effects that mirror the symptoms of Gulf War syndrome. Another hazardous substance that Gulf War servicemen and women also had to contend with was depleted uranium, which could be found in low levels in spent munitions, since it was known to increase the penetrative effectiveness of projectiles, and as a layer on heavily armored tanks because it was also prized for its protective qualities. Overall, DU-infused missiles hit a total of 21 NATO vehicles, while many troops suffered overexposure during a cleanup operation in July of 1991 after an accidental fire at Camp Doha in Kuwait destroyed many M1A1 tanks and munitions lined with depleted uranium. Lastly, low-level exposure to sarin, a nerve agent first synthesized in Germany in the 1930s, as well as mustard gas, a staple of chemical warfare created in 1822 and widely used in the First World War, have been pointed to as a possible high-risk factor for Gulf War syndrome. The appearance of these chemicals has been attributed to the bombing of Iraqi chemical plants from January 19th to the 24th of 1991, and the subsequent decision to disregard the warnings of chemical alarms on the basis that they were false and meant to cause panic among the Allies. Their emergence has also been traced to the destruction of an ammunition depot at Qamishiyah in Iraq in the aftermath of the war in March, which produced a plume later thought to contain nerve agents that were potentially inhaled by up to 95,000 personnel. What was the root cause? The cause of Gulf War syndrome was most likely the result of a combination of these toxins, and recent research has helped narrow down the candidates even further. Although many were convinced for a long time that their chronic condition was the result of irradiation, a study from 2020 from the University of Portsmouth examining the levels of depleted uranium in the bodies of patients diagnosed with Gulf War syndrome found that none had been majorly exposed to it. The mystery, however, according to some researchers, has been solved after a 2022 assessment funded by the U.S. government of over 1,000 Gulf War veterans affirmed that low-level sarin poisoning was the principal cause, with results demonstrating that those with a weaker PON1 gene, which plays an integral part in the breakdown of toxicants in the body, were found to be 9 times more likely to be diagnosed with Gulf War syndrome. Conclusion. Although the authors of the 2022 paper claim they have solved the puzzle of Gulf War syndrome, it will take further evaluations to fully confirm their findings. Nevertheless, it represents a watershed moment for those whose lives have been ruined by this debilitating disease, with treatments based on this research now being developed and likely to become available over the next few years. It's thanks to diligent scientific inquiry that veterans suffering from Gulf War syndrome will soon be able to recover that semblance of normality in their daily lives that was stolen from them by one of the most terrifying nerve gases of the modern era. NAM flashbacks, as they've become colloquially known, may be an entertaining internet meme, but the phrase actually reflects a very real mental health issue many veterans struggle with. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Although the Vietnam War ended in 1975 and PTSD wasn't known under this name until 1980, there was still a recognition of the impact that war had on the soldier's psyche. In 1915, during World War I, this condition was referred to as shell shock, and since then it has been called battle fatigue, Gulf War syndrome, and post-Vietnam syndrome, all of which had the same symptoms now known as PTSD. Soon after the Vietnam War had ended, Dr. Arthur S. Blank Jr., who had spent a year working in Vietnam's hospitals, was one of the first to recognize that veterans who had been diagnosed with illness such as alcoholism or schizophrenia were more likely to be suffering from war trauma. As the early post-war years passed, other clinicians drew the same conclusions, and by the late 1970s there was a medical push to recognize and officially define PTSD. Those suffering from the effects of the trauma and stressor-related disorder can experience a wide range of symptoms and are more likely to develop substance or alcohol dependency issues due to feelings of social alienation. Symptoms of PTSD include, among others, hypervigilance, negative emotions, trouble sleeping or concentrating, and outbursts of aggressive behavior. But one symptom in particular associated with Vietnam veterans is war flashbacks. These are vivid and sudden memories of traumatic experiences during the war. They can be triggered by sights, sounds, smells, or situations, and bring the veteran right back to the moment as if they were experiencing it all over again. These highly unsettling and upsetting recollections can manifest with physical responses, including aggression, and can significantly impact general mental health and the relationships of sufferers. One Vietnam War vet, Ed Smith, spoke about his experience with PTSD caused by the war and how it still affects him 50 years later. Even now, he reports struggling to fall asleep without checking his home's perimeter and wakes up multiple times to recheck everything is still secure. He said, quote, "I beat myself up that 1 year could affect my life so bad. That time in Vietnam is still very much there. It's like yesterday," end quote. A lot of veterans carry the weight of their experiences long after the conflict ends. This is really true for the Vietnam War, which stands out for the huge impact it had on veterans' mental health. But why is it that the Vietnam War is so closely associated with severe PTSD symptoms like war flashbacks? A large part of the reason for this is because initial small community-based studies found Vietnam veterans to have higher rates of PTSD and other mental conditions than others in active military service. It was a time at which medical studies had turned in greater force to analyzing psychology and mental health, and the lasting impact of being in an active war zone started to be realized and codified. Naturally, as a result, this greater recognition led to greater diagnosis levels that were later re-examined and in some cases deemed inaccurate. But the Vietnam War was a complicated era in American military history, and its perception back home and treatment of its veterans certainly exacerbated the overall mental health impact of returning soldiers and the subsequent support they received. Anti-war protests and the lack of a clear, decisive victory against the Viet Cong meant that they didn't receive the wholehearted support veterans of other wars did. Vietnam became the U.S.'s dirty little secret almost, and in response, veterans were ignored and stigmatized, with very few receiving any mental health or any other sort of support. One Air Force veteran identified only as Jim later said, quote, "It got to the point where if anybody asked me I was in Vietnam, I would just say no," end quote. There has to this day only been one wide-scale comprehensive study of the impact of the Vietnam War on veterans. The first part, known as the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, or NVVRS, initially took place from 1986 to 1988 and was followed up on 40 years later. The study looked specifically at trauma caused by the war, comparing Vietnam theater veterans, those directly involved in combat, to era veterans who served but didn't experience being in an active war zone, and their civilian counterparts. In the initial part of the study in the 1980s, results found that 15% of all existing PTSD cases were Vietnam theater veterans, and that 1 in 3 men and 1 in 4 women in the Vietnam theater would suffer from PTSD at some point during their lives. The study confirmed that PTSD didn't occur in a vacuum, and sadly its effects were far more long-reaching, impacting both mental and physical health and even family relationships and friendships. The study also showed that your race could impact the likelihood of developing PTSD, with Hispanic people being 14% more likely to develop symptoms than their Caucasian counterparts. Other smaller studies correlated this, with estimates of the numbers of Vietnam veterans suffering from PTSD reaching up to 30%. Many didn't speak out about their trauma initially. It was only in later years did they begin to discuss the long-term effects and the impact it had. PTSD affects all spheres of life and family, and Ed Smith shared that his wife divorced him and his daughter no longer speaks to him as a result of his PTSD. Another, a U.S. Marine named Warren, spoke about his struggles with drug and drink addiction as a result of the flashbacks he experienced after Vietnam. He spent years experiencing trauma that manifested as, quote, clammy hands, stood out in the pouring rain in my yard, like I was still in the war, end quote. In many ways, Warren was one of the lucky ones. He's now received treatment and help and has confronted his PTSD and what triggers an attack, allowing him to live a normal life. But this was after decades of trauma with no mental health or specialist support to help curb his addictions or tackle the reality of what he had seen facing down the Viet Cong. The landmark NVVRS study was followed up on over 20 years later in the period 2012 to 2013 to see how many Vietnam veterans were still experiencing trauma and to see what new conclusions could be drawn based on the advancement of the theory of PTSD diagnosis since the original study. This portion was known as the National Vietnam Veterans Longitudinal Study, or NVVLS. 1,632 theater veterans and 716 era veterans replied to the follow-up study, which contained a self-report survey booklet, a computer-assisted telephone interview, and for a random few, a clinical diagnostic telephone interview. The results highlighted the impact of PTSD on a person as a whole and its long-term effects, as it was found that 12.2% of Vietnam theater veterans still suffered its effects. It was found those with PTSD were twice as likely to have died in the intervening period as those who didn't, and that the stress level was a directly contributing factor, with those in high-exposure locations twice as likely to die as those in low or moderate war zone exposure locations. This could be explained by the onset of physical conditions in Vietnam veterans with PTSD, as it was found a third reported a history of heart disease, and more than half reported conditions like arthritis. These appear to have a link with PTSD, as they were more likely to report a history of chronic conditions. Although the NVVLS was limited and didn't delve too much into external factors that could also cause later illness or diseases, it still exemplified how PTSD is a lifelong condition and its significant impact on all walks of life. But nothing underscores the horrors of an active war zone and its psychological effects more than the actual stories told by survivors. Many talk of flashbacks turned into nightmares that resulted in substance abuse, violent outbursts, and attempted suicide. That's why veterans like David Hansen are speaking out in their later years, urging others to get help, to get therapy, and to contact a Veterans Association for support. A lot of those who are still alive today went to Vietnam when they were barely adults and saw the horrors of war at just 19 or 20 years old. Some of them may not have spent more than a year in Vietnam, but it was enough for a lifetime of consequences. One of them recalled, quote, "I would wake up with a start, sit up, drenched in sweat, trembling, frightened, like a big firefight had just happened, and I don't know why," end quote. Even today, almost 50 years after the end of the war, the survivors rely heavily on the support and camaraderie they receive at the VA, finally allowing them to address the trauma and PTSD that the Vietnam War caused.
A land fit for heroes? The treatment of World War I veterans in Great Britain. They were the pride of their nation when World War I started. Masses of young Britons, many barely legally eligible to enlist, responded to the call of their country to fight the war. Many of them who were too young to fight. Boys as young as 16 or 17 years old lied about their age, as they didn't want to stay in the safety of their homes. They wanted to take part in the war and serve their country. Many didn't know the reasons why the war had started. The king called them to arms, and they were willing to serve. Such was the state of mind of the whole nation. Who else would fight if not these brave individuals? They truly were national heroes, and they were sent off to war with chants and praise. The romantic image of war changed the instant they arrived at the front line. It was nothing like they had imagined. During the next 4 years, they would give up every part of their youth to serve in makeshift trenches in a country that was not even their own. Far from their homes, they endured a savage war where violence and death were part of everyday life. Death lurked around every corner. Snipers, artillery shells, and poison gas. The gruesome deaths they saw on a daily basis would haunt them for the rest of their lives. At some point, one would stop fearing for their life, because they knew that death was sure to come for them. It made no difference how or when it happened. In those 4 years of war, these young men matured beyond their years. To live and fight in such conditions left great scars on their souls and minds. Those that survived and returned home would never be the same again. But their expectation was that life would be normal once they came back to their home and family. They were wrong. Being a First World War veteran in your early 20s was a burden by itself. Returning to normal life from the experience of the muddy trenches in France was very difficult. Ex-servicemen were met with little empathy. Civilians who had spent the war in the safety of British cities and towns just couldn't comprehend what their soldiers had gone through. Families and friends couldn't understand what veterans had seen and experienced. But one thing they didn't expect was the rejection that they would face. In a situation of mass unemployment, there were no jobs for veterans. Those who left everything when their country called upon them now faced a new battle, trying to find employment. Some employers even actively avoided hiring ex-servicemen, and businesses had signs saying no ex-servicemen need apply. Returning to their pre-war lives with proper jobs that would allow them to feed their families was a long and difficult process. The government, pressured by the increasing number of jobless veterans, failed to respond to their demands and provide adequate pensions and employment. Veterans felt resentment towards their government. In response to this, organizations were formed to help them find their way back to civilian life. In 1921, the 4 largest veterans organizations united into the British Legion. Service, not self, was their motto. It was much more difficult for disabled veterans. Almost 1 million British soldiers died in the Great War, but twice as many came home with some level of disability. Of these veterans, 750,000 were permanently disabled and 40,000 were amputees. Some soldiers came home without both their legs or arms, or were blind, deaf, with their faces disfigured, or their lungs were destroyed by poison gas. Thousands suffered from shell shock, a psychological condition known today as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Unlike their comrades who were jobless but able to work, disabled veterans were denied the possibility to return to the jobs they had when they left to join the war. Their attention, therefore, turned to the government, the same one that sent them to the battlefields where they had lost their limbs. As heroes, they deserved care and comfort, but all hope was futile. The government did provide disability pensions for all veterans depending on the level of their disability, but this was far from enough to have a decent living, far from what they would have had with a proper job. The government claimed that they could do nothing more in their responsibility for disabled servicemen. The whole effort of finding jobs for them and their reintegration into society was transferred to patriotic well-doers. In such a situation, a number of movements, organizations, and individuals put together courses and training programs for veterans to learn new skills that could help them find new jobs. They organized charities, helped ex-servicemen in every possible manner, and showed them that they were people who appreciated their sacrifice. It wasn't easy for battle-hardened veterans to live on charity, but the government left them no choice. Of all the major belligerent European states, only Great Britain relied on voluntary efforts to employ disabled ex-servicemen. At the time, an image of a limbless veteran begging on the streets was a common sight, not just in Great Britain, but across Europe. Soldiers who fought against each other in the war shared the same fate. However, only in Great Britain were unsatisfied veterans restrained from turning their anger into violence. In Germany, where they also had a large population of disabled veterans, riots and uprisings were frequent occurrences. In France, veterans' organizations were often involved in various political pressures on the government and therefore had a greater impact on the state's policy towards them. British veterans of the First World War had trusted their nation when the war had started in 1914. But after 1918, it seemed like the promise of a land fit for heroes was not a reality.
The 1,000-yard stare, shell shock in World War I. The 1,000-yard stare, it can be simply defined as the unfocused gaze of someone who has seen too much. It's a characteristic of those who have experienced war and combat zones and is most commonly associated with the victims of shell shock, or in today's terminology, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. By the time World War I came around in 1914, technology and weaponry had advanced greatly since the days of Napoleon. Battlefields were deadlier, with more varied and horrific ways of attacking and killing the enemy, leading to psychological trauma en masse in a way that really hadn't been seen before. The first recorded use of the term shell shock was by Dr. and Captain Charles S. Myers, writing a report for the paper The Lancet in February 1915. In it, he examined the cases of 3 young men he studied, 2 privates and a corporal, breaking down the symptoms they displayed. From here, a list of common but extremely varied symptoms of shell shock was defined, which included sleeplessness, anxiety, fear, harassing sights and experiences, mania, mental confusion, memory loss, hallucinations and delusions, severe psychosis, and in some cases, a complete mental breakdown or mental stupor. As well as these mental symptoms, physical symptoms were also recorded such as headaches, nausea, and dizziness, also referred to as neurasthenia. Dr. William Aldrin Turner, building off Myers' report, wrote about his findings at base hospitals in France. Dr. Turner spoke about neurasthenia and the impact of witnessing extreme war violence on an individual. He stressed the link between physical symptoms and mental issues, strongly identifying cases where mental shock led to other physiological symptoms, such as deaf mutism that continued long after it should have subsided. Although 1915 was the first recorded mention of shell shock, it's now estimated that by December 1914, 7 to 10% of all British officers and 3 to 4% of other ranks were suffering from it. In the cases of those with neurasthenia, Turner recommended rest and recovery at home, although the degree of severity of nervous shock and neurasthenia affected his recommendations. The 3 men that Myers observed had all been victims of recent nearby shell explosions, suffering from mental fog thereafter. But Turner had the benefit of observing multiple participants over a longer stretch of time, meaning he was able to draw further distinctions between differing types of shell shock, which he referred to as nervous shock. In fact, Turner may have been the first to recognize that it was not just acts of war, such as a nearby explosion or one specific traumatic incident that led to those cases of shock, but that what he referred to as general wear and tear could impact mentally over time, resulting in shell shock. Interestingly, Turner also identified that it's not just war that caused this, but specific war conditions were more likely to cause cases of shell shock than others. For example, Turner observed that the intensity of the fighting on the front lines impacted this, highlighting that more cases were seen from the severe fighting in Flanders and around Ypres than other battles. These earlier battles notably suffered from heavy artillery fire, which could go some way to explain the increase in number of shell shock cases. Regardless, shell shock was both a new and increasing epidemic during World War I, with physicians working hard to understand the new phenomenon, at the same time as dealing with countless cases of it in their frontline soldiers. While the early reports of Myers and Turner are quite positive, saying that recovery is favorable and likely for these soldiers and that time is simply needed in most cases for rest and recovery, it later became apparent this wasn't quite the case. By 1916, very few cases of shell shock had returned to fighting. At one Red Cross hospital, only 21% of discharges returned to military duty, and Gordon Holmes, the consultant neurologist to the British Expeditionary Forces, reported that the base hospitals in France, where the fighting was strongest, were seeing return rates of 30 to 40% in comparison to the UK's 4 to 5%. As cases increased, understanding almost seemed to go backward, more than likely due to the panic over realization of how many soldiers were affected in Britain. Although initially physicians like Myers and Turner advocated for hypnotherapy psychotherapy measures to help treat shell shock, over the next few years the efficacy of their methods began to be questioned. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Holmes was brought in to replace Myers, and his methods, while more in line with the British Army's desires, unfortunately did a lot to undermine recent discoveries on the impact of shell shock on its sufferers, and set in motion a string of events that led to the demonization of those dealing with the mental illness. Notably, his reporting on relapse rates was much lower than the actual figures and didn't take into account the high number of the men treated for shell shock that never returned to active warfare. Sadly, fundamentally, the general British belief became one that shell shock was down to a weakness of mind and spirit rather than anything else. It's possible this general mentality is what actually made shell shock so prominent in the British forces, with the general populace believing strongly in the mantras "stiff upper lip" and "we are British, we carry on," that led to a general subconscious abhorrence to any ailment of a mental nature. Unfortunately, things only got worse from there for those who experienced shell shock. Holmes subsequently shut Myers' centers dedicated to treating the illness and reallocated them to soldiers with venereal diseases. It is he who we partly have to thank for the decades-long perception of the casualties of war, reducing shell shock to simple cowardice or feebleness of mind. While his legacy may not have been favorable to him, it is somewhat well-deserved, as his actions at the time directly led to some of the harsh treatment methods these patients experienced. For example, the most severe cases of shell shock were shipped off to mental asylums and dedicated hospitals, where treatment ranged wildly from the reasonable to the completely inhumane. The most famous or infamous example of this was the work by Dr. Louis Yealand, whose methods, even then, were seen as controversial. Yealand strongly believed in Faradism, the use of electricity in therapy, much like the electroshock therapy used until the 1980s. In his 1918 work, Historical Disorders of Warfare, he gleefully documented the treatment types he used on sufferers of shell shock, describing them as successful despite their barbarism. One of the main methods Yealand favored included applying electric shocks to the throat, neck, and limbs forcibly for horrifying long extended periods of time, sometimes berating the patient verbally while doing so. In some cases, he went so far as to also apply hot plates to the skin and put out lit cigarettes on the end of the patient's tongue. What that would do to cure shell shock may be anybody's guess, but Yealand was convinced that his methods were the right ones. The nuances and different treatments of shell shock varied dramatically across World War I, and by the end of the conflict there was still no great consensus on the illness among medical professionals. What followed was silent suffering. Soldiers unwilling or unable to discuss their shell shock, coupled with the disdain and belief of cowardice that stained those who experienced it, meant that over the next decade after the war, little progress was made in understanding shell shock or its effects. The most notable inquiry was that of the Southborough Report in 1922. But even in the paper's findings, opinions over the cause of shell shock were sharply divided among the groups of experts consulted. Rather than addressing this difficulty and defining the key causes of shell shock, the paper focused on recommendations for future affairs and largely blamed the illness on things such as a lack of training in troops in certain battles. Regardless of the justifications and investigations, the fact remains that to the British military at least, World War I shell shock sufferers were largely regarded as cowards, and in many instances were even shot for it on the front lines. Even putting aside the fact that many would balk in the face of war and certain death, these men were not cowards, but sufferers of an illness brought on by the horrendous reality they were forced to face daily. They deserve recognition and an apology for the reputation they earned because of this. But incredibly, it took until 2006 for an official pardon to be issued to those shot in the name of cowardice during World War I. And decades for sufferers of mental illness to be taken seriously.
The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the Silent Sentinels. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is at the Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington County, Virginia, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., and was erected in 1921 as an eternal resting place for the unknown American soldier killed in France during the First World War. It was a monument to all those unknown American servicemen who died serving their country in the Great War. In the future, the United States of America were to become embroiled in other conflicts, such as World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. In these three wars, hundreds of thousands of American lives were lost. The identity of many of these fallen servicemen was never determined. They too were paid tribute by lying down bodies of unknown soldiers near their comrades from World War I. From then on, the tomb of the unknown soldier became a monument to the memory of all unknown servicemen who died fighting for the United States of America. More recently, they have built the Northwood Gratitude and Honor Memorial in Irvine, California, which remembers all of the fallen American heroes of the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts since 2003. The idea of building a monument to the unknown fallen soldiers arose after the First World War. During the war, the United States had lost over 130,000 servicemen. A great number of those men were buried far from their homes in special mass cemeteries in France near the battlefields where they had lost their lives. The number of those whose identity was unknown was not inconsiderate. It was a similar situation with the other combatant countries. The French and British were the first to create tombs for the unknown soldiers in the memory of their fallen men. In France, the tomb was placed at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The unknown British soldier was buried inside Westminster Abbey. Soon, the idea was adopted by other countries in Europe. In the United States, Brigadier General William D. Connor, who commanded the American troops in France during the war, advocated a similar idea after hearing of the French project. He proposed the idea to the Chief of Staff, General Peyton C. March, on October 29, 1919. But he dismissed the idea as it was thought that the Army Graves Registration Service would eventually identify all of the American dead, so there wouldn't be a need for such a memorial. On December 21, 1920, the New York Congressman Hamilton Fish Jr. introduced a resolution calling for the body of an unidentified American soldier who was killed in France to be returned back to the United States and to be put into a tomb, to be specially built at the Memorial Amphitheater in the Arlington National Cemetery. Congress approved this measure on March 4, 1921. Arlington was already known as the burial place of the unknown American soldiers. The cemetery was established during the American Civil War on land that belonged to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The Union Army used it to bury 16,000 of its soldiers. After the war in 1866, the bodies of 2,111 unidentified soldiers killed at the Battle of Bull Run were reburied in a mass grave marked by a stone monument. Arlington was the perfect location for the new tomb. The question was, how would they select who should be buried inside of it? While waiting for congressional approval to build the tomb in March 1921, the United States already had 1,200 dead soldiers whose identities were still being processed. The Army wanted to make sure that there wasn't the slightest possibility of the chosen unknown soldier's body being identified at a later stage. Eventually, in September 1921, 4 bodies were exhumed, one from each of the 4 American cemeteries in France. The bodies were inspected to confirm that the soldiers had died from combat wounds, and there were no records of their identification. After the inspection, they put the bodies in caskets and sent them to Chalon-sur-Marne. Over there, the honor of choosing the body for the tomb was given to Sergeant Edward S. Younger, a highly decorated infantryman still on active duty. The day before, American and French soldiers moved the caskets around to make sure no one knew from which cemetery each of them came from. Sergeant Younger made his choice by placing a spray of roses on top of one of the caskets. The body of the unknown soldier was then placed in a sealed coffin and shipped to the States on board the USS Olympia. The other 3 bodies were buried in a cemetery near Paris. The unknown soldier's body arrived in Washington on November 9, 1921. It was displayed the following day in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, where in just one day, 90,000 citizens paid their respects to the unknown soldier. On November 11, 1921, on the anniversary of Armistice Day, the body was taken in a funeral procession from the Capitol to the Arlington Cemetery, where a state funeral ceremony was held. A field artillery battery from the nearby Capitol Mall fired a salvo every minute during the procession. They paused only during the 2-minute period of silence at the beginning of the ceremony. Before it was laid in the tomb, President Warren G. Harding placed a Medal of Honor on the coffin. Admiral of the Fleet Lord Beatty also laid the Victoria Cross Medal on the coffin on behalf of King George V and the British public. The original tomb from 1921 consisted of only a 3-level slab made of white marble. The tomb was projected to serve as a foundation for a bigger monument which was yet to be built. In 1926, Congress authorized the completion of the tomb by placing an appropriate monument on the existing foundation. A competition was held to design the structure and was won by sculptor Thomas Hudson Jones and architect Lorimer Rich, who were awarded the contract to build the monument. The neoclassical monument in the shape of a sarcophagus was made of the finest and whitest American marble, the Yule marble. The monument was impressive, with a height of 11 feet or 3.3 meters. It was 8 feet or 2.4 meters wide and 13 feet 11 inches or 4.2 meters long at the base. The top had a width of 6 feet 8 inches or 2 meters and a length of 12 feet 7 inches or 3.8 meters. The weight of the entire tomb was an enormous 160,000 pounds or 80 tons. The north and south panels of the monument were decorated with 6 inverted wreaths separated with Doric pilasters. The initial idea was for the wreaths to represent the world of memories, but they later became the symbols of the 6 largest World War I battles in which the American forces fought. The east panel facing the city of Washington had a composition of 3 figures representing peace, victory, and valor, but also 3 allies from the war, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. The opposite panel facing the amphitheater had an inscription carved upon it. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God. The monument was mounted on the existing tomb in December 1931, giving it the appearance that we see today. In the early days, there weren't any guards posted at the monument. It was only in 1925 that a unit was deployed to watch the monument during the day. In 1926, the monument was put under permanent 24-hour watch. There wasn't any particular unit assigned for the duty at the time, but they all came from the Army as the oldest branch of the armed forces. However, in 1946, the duty of guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier was permanently presented to the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment. Better known as the Old Guard, the 3rd Infantry was one of the oldest units of the U.S. Army and was responsible for performing all ceremonial duties in the capital and for protecting it in emergencies. Guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier is, however, the most honorable of all their duties. At the same time, it's one of their most onerous duties, as it calls for nothing less than perfection. All members of the 3rd Infantry Regiment are eligible for the duty, which is carried out on a voluntary basis. In order to become a sentinel of the tomb, one must have an impeccable military record and pass rigorous tests and interviews. Those who meet the requirements are sent for intensive training with the goal of achieving perfection in every aspect of the sentinel duty. The duty of a sentinel is highly stressful, as it's exposed to constant review and inspection in order to maintain the set standard. For this reason, many sentinels give up or are withdrawn from duty after only a few months. Those who remain in service for more than 9 months are entitled to wear the sentinel badge permanently, an insignia in the shape of the tomb with laurels around and an inscription Honor Guard. Apart from the badge, tomb sentinels are distinctive for the impeccable Army dress blue uniforms and sunglasses they wear because of the bright reflection of the white marble. While on duty, sentinels protect the tomb by marching back and forth on a 63-foot or 19-meter rubber mat placed on a plateau west of the tomb. The path has to be crossed in exactly 21 steps, after which the sentinel makes a 21-second pause, turns around, makes another 21-second pause, and walks back in 21 steps. The symbolism of the number is connected to the 21-gun salute, the highest salute used in military ceremonies. All the time, the sentinel keeps his weapon on his shoulder closest to the visitors as a gesture of protecting the tomb from all threats. If a visitor violates the restricted area, the sentinel brings his rifle to the front as a warning sign. If the warning fails, only then will he shout out a warning. Apart from that, the entire duty is performed in complete silence, hence the nickname, the Silent Sentinels. Guards are relieved every half an hour. In the ceremony of changing guards, an officer of the guard inspects the guard's uniform and weapons. During wintertime, guards change every hour, while on the night shifts, the change takes place every 2 hours. For 35 years, the tomb was a monument to the soldiers fallen in World War I only. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed a bill to honor the unknown soldiers killed in World War II and the Korean War in the same manner. True to the tradition, the internment ceremony that took place in 1958 was exactly the same one held in 1921. When choosing the remains of a World War II unknown soldier, one body was taken from the European theater of war and one from the Pacific. The Korean unknown soldier was chosen from among 4 bodies exhumed from the National Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii. Both unknown soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor before their bodies were interred in the crypts on the plateau west of the tomb on May 30, 1958. The last unknown soldier to be interred at the site was one from the Vietnam War on May 28, 1984, Memorial Day. His body was laid in a new crypt placed between his comrades from World War II and Korea. 10 years later, however, independent research determined the probable identity of the soldier. A DNA test taken in 1998 positively identified the body as belonging to Lieutenant Michael J. Blassie. After his family expressed a wish to bury Blassie in his hometown, the body was exhumed and the crypt left empty. From then on, it represented the memory of all those American servicemen whose bodies were never found. Even though it has no official name, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is the most iconic monument at the Arlington National Cemetery, reminding the nation of all those who gave the ultimate sacrifice in serving their country.